In a sprawling mansion on the edge of the city, a secret lingered behind polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers. For years, the wealthy Harrison family had hidden away their only son, Daniel, a boy whose pale blue eyes had never seen the dawn. The world called him a miracle of privilege, but behind those high iron gates, he lived in darkness. Doctors from across the country had tried and failed. The father, a sharp-tongued real estate magnate, had spent millions searching for a cure, growing bitter and distant with each failed treatment. Then came Ruth, a quiet black woman hired to work as a maid. She moved with a grace that spoke of resilience and kept to herself, seldom drawing attention to herself. But one summer afternoon, as Daniel sat quietly in the garden, Ruth reached out, placed her weathered hand over his eyes, and whispered a prayer. What followed defied science, shocked the household, and exposed truths about power, prejudice, and the unseen strength that lives within the most overlooked. The Harrison estate sat like a fortress on the edge of a quiet suburban town. Neighbors admired its tall white pillars and sprawling lawns, but whispered about the tragedy that lay within. Daniel, now 9 years old, had been born blind. His father, Richard Harrison, refused to believe that money couldn't fix everything. His frustration hardened into anger, and that anger often turned toward those who worked in his home. The staff rotated frequently: housekeepers, nurses, even tutors, all of whom were dismissed after falling short of the father's impossible expectations. Daniel grew accustomed to new voices and new footsteps in the halls, but never knew kindness. When Ruth arrived, she was unlike anyone the Harrisons had hired before. A widow in her 60s, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her hands bore the calluses of decades of labor, yet she moved as if every task held purpose. Richard barely acknowledged her presence. To him, she was just another maid to keep the estate spotless. But to Daniel, who often sat on the veranda listening to the rustle of leaves, Ruth's soft humming brought a sense of calm. The household had long stopped hoping for change. Daniel's condition was deemed permanent, his world destined to remain in shadow. Ruth never questioned the diagnosis aloud, but in her heart, she believed that sometimes answers came not from wealth or science, but from faith and the compassion of human touch. No one in the mansion imagined that Ruth's belief would soon collide with Richard's pride and alter the boy's life forever. The early days passed quietly. Ruth worked in the background, dusting bookshelves, polishing silver, tending to the garden where Daniel liked to sit. She never intruded on his solitude, but when he lingered outside, she would sometimes pause in her work to hum old hymns from her childhood. Daniel would tilt his head toward the sound, drawn to the warmth in her voice. Over time, he began to ask her small questions about the scents of the flowers, the feel of the changing seasons. Ruth answered patiently, never treating him as fragile. Richard noticed their rapport and disliked it. He resented how easily the boy responded to her presence when he himself could not reach his son. To Richard, Ruth was a servant and nothing more. Her growing closeness to Daniel felt like a threat. One evening, after a particularly disheartening call with yet another specialist who offered no new hope, Richard lashed out. He accused Ruth of distracting his son from real solutions. Ruth said nothing, but the next morning, Daniel woke with tear-stained cheeks. What the father couldn't see was how the boy's isolation had grown heavier over the years. Ruth became his quiet anchor, teaching him to sense the garden's paths by the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes, to recognize when the roses bloomed by the scent that drifted through the air. Then came the day that changed everything. Daniel, seated on the veranda, complained that the sunlight felt different, almost sharp against his closed lids. Ruth, sensing his distress, knelt before him. She cupped his face gently, brushed her thumb across his eyelids, and said a soft prayer under her breath. To Daniel, it felt as if warmth seeped from her palm into his skin. For the first time, he sensed a flicker, faint and uncertain, behind the darkness. He didn't tell his father. He wasn't sure it was real. But each day after, Ruth encouraged him to keep his face toward the morning light. Richard, growing more irritable over wasted money and dashed hopes, remained oblivious. He was too consumed by his pride to notice the quiet shift taking place in his son's world. A storm rolled across the horizon one evening as Richard hosted a dinner party for his business associates. The house glowed with candlelight, and laughter echoed through the halls. But Daniel sat quietly in his room upstairs, his fingers tracing the grooves of the wooden window frame. Ruth checked on him before returning to the kitchen. She found him restless, sensing the storm's electricity in the air. He murmured that he could see something, as if the lightning outside was painting fleeting patterns against his darkness. For Ruth, it was a sign. She led him to the veranda despite the drizzling rain, holding his hand with a steadiness that calmed his trembling. Below them, Richard stepped out with his guests to admire the storm's power, unaware of what was unfolding above. As another flash of lightning streaked the sky, Daniel blinked rapidly. For an instant he gasped. A shape had emerged, faint, blurred, but real. It was Ruth's face, lined with years of toil, yet glowing with gentle strength. Tears welled up in his eyes. Ruth, too, felt a shiver of awe, but said nothing more than another whispered prayer, her hand pressing softly over his lids as the rain dripped around them. The commotion below grew louder as thunder cracked. Richard glanced upward and saw the two figures on the veranda, his blind son standing unsteadily beside the maid. He stormed up the stairs, furious at the sight. He accused Ruth of filling the boy's head with fantasies. But Daniel, clutching Ruth's hand, turned his face toward his father and said in a trembling voice that he could see the glow of the lightning. The guests, drawn by the uproar, witnessed the scene in stunned silence. Richard's anger faltered as he saw something in his son's eyes he hadn't seen before. Focus. The impossible had begun to unfold not through wealth or science, but through the care of the very woman he had dismissed. In the days that followed, specialists confirmed what Richard could not deny. Daniel's vision, once deemed permanently lost, was gradually returning. The improvement defied all medical explanation. Reporters clamored for interviews. Scientists debated theories. But through it all, Ruth remained quiet, going about her work as she always had. For Daniel, the first things he truly saw were the garden he had come to know by scent and sound, and the face of the woman who had guided him through his darkness. Richard's pride crumbled. The man who had measured worth in money now faced the truth. His fortune had never brought his son what he needed most: patience, kindness, and faith. In time, he publicly thanked Ruth, though the words came haltingly. He began to treat her not as a servant, but as the heart of the household that had once been cold and distant. The story spread far beyond the mansion's gates, stirring conversations about how easily society overlooks those who live and labor in the shadows. It wasn't about miracles, some said. It was about the power of compassion to unlock what had seemed impossible. Daniel, now able to see the sunlight he had only felt on his skin before, often asked Ruth to join him in the garden. Together they would watch the roses bloom, the same flowers whose scent had once been his only picture of the world. Their story became a reminder that hope can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the people dismissed as insignificant hold the key to the most profound changes in our lives. As one journalist wrote after meeting the family, in a mansion built on wealth, it was the steady hands of a humble maid that opened a boy's eyes to the world, and a father's heart to his son. The question lingered long after the headlines faded. How many other lives might be transformed if we looked beyond status and truly saw each other's humanity?